Politics Ahead.
And on the left, we have Paul Richards, the former Labour Special Advisor. And on the right, Harrison Allman-Varty, who is a Conservative Borough councillor. Thank you to you both. Welcome.
Morning.
Now, let's start with that story, actually, because the heating bill of Liz Kendall being paid by us. So the optics of this are absolutely dreadful. Paul Richards, former Labour Special Advisor, if you're taking fuel payments away from pensioners whilst claiming an absolutely extortionate amount yourself, thereby showing that as the Minister you are very much aware of how much an average energy bill is, knock it on £4,000 over 15 months. This is terrible optics, isn't it?
Well, the great strength of our democracy is we have local MPs who represent a local area and then come to Westminster and vote on behalf of their communities. I would hate to see a system like we had maybe 30 years ago where MPs all lived in London and went to their constituency 3 times a year and made a speech and stayed in the Station Hotel and expected a brass band to greet them. You know, I think they should be enmeshed in their community. So if we're going to have that system, strong system of having local MPs, they live in 2 places at once. And it's a very odd setup. Most people don't live in 2 places at once, but MPs do. And then the question is, well, how are we going to fund that? Now, we could just double their salaries and allow them to spend the money how they want, but we don't. We give them a system of expenses, which means that the state accepts this weird setup and therefore has to stump up for things like heating. I mean, Liz Kendall's not the only one. Obviously, she's been singled out.
No, and there's no.
You said, Cristo, she's done nothing wrong.
Yeah, there's no suggestion that the rules
she can't be blamed for the rise in gas prices either, can she? Because we all know that for everyone, that's gone up through the roof.
Yeah, true, but this is a story about optics, and when you're overseeing a policy, I mean, Harrison, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong to say that the optics are bad on this, because as Paul is pointing out, no rules have been broken. This is the system by which we live. You know, maybe this is a bit of a storm in a teacup. What do you think?
Oh, I completely agree with you. The optics are absolutely terrible. I mean, it was bad enough with Lord Ali. At least that was private money. This is now public money. I think that the point that was made on based on, she should take it. I mean, isn't the story that she kind of lives in, Notting Hill in a £4 million house with her wealthy banker? But I think personally, if you're very, very low income or you don't have that much savings from an MP, maybe it makes sense. But to be someone who can afford to pay it and you're still taking it is terrible.
Yeah, but then aren't you sort of making a point there about whether we should be means testing MPs for the expenses that they can have? And that I don't think that's particularly practical either. I mean, I happen to actually agree that MPs probably should get these expenses because I think it's probably the least worst solution. But I think that if you are going to do that, you need to be mindful that the policies that you bring in, they are going to come under more increased scrutiny based on the privileges you get as an MP. Harrison.
I personally think that MPs should be paid more. I think the Prime Minister should be on something like £1 million a year, right? And I think that MPs should be responsible for paying their heating, because just like everybody else who works is responsible for paying their heating and their food bills and everything else. I don't think MPs should be exempt from that. I think the standards should be higher, and I think the annual payment should be higher, because I think this whole thing with expenses is clearly they cannot be trusted on knowing where to draw the line and what's what. I mean, you had things like Angela Rayner claiming her AirPods and iPad as expenses, and it's ridiculous. I think you pay them more and you draw the line there and you say you make that work, and if you can't,
so what would you pay them?
An MP?
Yes.
Well, I mean, for an MP, I mean, it obviously depends on whether you pay those in government slightly more. I think it should be in the case of about, I don't know, £300,000. It should be more. It should be something where very talented people shouldn't feel as if they have to take a pay cut to leave to go into politics.
All right, what do you think of that solution, Paul? So we don't have any expenses, but because you're expected to run 2 households, because you're expected to buy a lot of stuff as an MP, because you need laptops, you need all of this stuff, we get rid of expenses, £300,000 a year as an MP.
Well, I don't think I'd set it quite that high, but I certainly think that you could double the rate of pay for an MP and then sort of remove most of the expenses regime. And as I said at the outset, they could make their own choices about how to fund their second homes and their bills and all the rest of it. I mean, going back to the 1840s, believe it or not, the Chartists, the great radical democracy campaigners demanded MPs to be paid. And they did that because they wanted anyone that could be elected to come forward and serve. It shouldn't just be the people with private incomes who are able to do this. And there is a democratic principle here that if we want people to serve us and to represent us and to come to London and vote on our behalves, we've got to pay them to do it. Otherwise, it'll just be the aristocracy again doing it, or very rich people like Nigel Farage when he turns up, And so I think there is an argument for paying our public servants a lot more, and Harrison says, expecting the best from them and encouraging the best people to come forward into politics, so it's not a narrow class. But my question to Harrison is, do you claim expenses? Because you're an elected representative and presumably you're voting on things for people less privileged than you, and yet the state is paying you, isn't it?
I get paid £5,700 a year, so you can go think about how crazy that is. And I've never claimed a single penny in expenses, and that is declared every year with the. No, I don't. I think, look, I'm quite fortunate, right? I've got a decent amount of money, and I think that I'm not in a position. I don't want to claim expenses. There are people that live in the area that need that money more than me. Someone who lives in a £4 million house in Notting Hill should not be claiming expenses. I think it's just typical Labour. I think it's just.
You don't claim anything, Harrison?
Not a penny in expenses, no.
But then, I mean...
But you get an allowance as a councillor, don't you? You're not saying you don't get anything at all.
Right, so I get £5,700, which is just a basic allowance, which is actually quite low compared to some of the councils.
Sure. But I'm not complaining about that system, but I'm just saying the state pays you as a representative in the same way that Liz Kendall gets her money from the taxpayer to do her job too.
No, that's slightly, in fairness, it's slightly different, isn't it? In as much as it's not, no. Well, one is forgive me if I'm wrong, but an allowance to do the job. The other is an expense, and those are two different things, aren't they? What we're talking about with Liz Kendall is an expense, not an allowance she gets to do the job or a salary.
Well, it's giving her two places to work because we're expected to be in two places during the week, which I say for most people is unheard of. It's not a question of commuting to work. She works as an MP, half the week in the constituency, and then she's a member of Parliament and a minister on top of that. She's doing 2-3 jobs, really.
But to Harrison's point, Paul, I mean, you just sort of, forgive me for saying, but I think you just tried to have a little gotcha moment there with Harrison by saying, look, do you claim any expenses? And Liz Kendall could very easily do what Harrison does and says, well, actually, no, you know what? I'm in a very privileged position. I live in this £4 million house. I've got a husband who's a banker who went to Eton. I could do what Harrison does and not claim anything. And she doesn't do that, does she?
Well, that's your point, Cristo, of whether we start means testing members of Parliament and deciding how much they get or don't get. But I think if they do the job and if they're in the government and if they are taking that responsibility on, it should be a fair whack for the job that it involves. I mean, Harrison's saying put it up to £300,000 a year. I mean, there are people in business that look at our public sector salaries and just think they're absurd. And people in other political systems, too, that just look at how we resource our democracy, how many staff they have, the sort of people that can come and do the jobs for the money, and just laugh at our system. So I know it sounds like a lot of money. Of course it does, and it is a lot of money. But, compared to the private sector and or other systems, it really isn't. And if we want the best people to run the country, and we're always complaining about how badly everything is run, then you're going to have to attract people in with support for them to do the job.
All right. When we return, thank you to you both. When we return, we'll talk about a couple of the other big stories of the day, including whether it's a good or a bad thing that Elon Musk might be involving himself with a huge donation in British politics, and it will be to neither of the two parties represented today on our head-to-head. We'll do that next here on Talk. I don't know whether this is a good story for either of you two this morning, but this is a really big story when it comes to political donations. Elon Musk apparently declaring war on Sir Keir Starmer. This is how it's being written in the Times this morning, Sunday Times. Apparently, $100 million could be donated to the Reform Party in order to facilitate Nigel Farage becoming Prime Minister. I mean, Harrison, what do you think of this?
I think it's a great story. I mean, I know that the natural Conservative and the natural Labour kind of councillors and members will be probably quite scared at that, but I'm a big fan of Elon's, and I actually like Nigel Farage as well. Unfortunately, I think he should be in the Tory party. So I think it's quite an exciting story. It's quite interesting, the spending laws in this country, that obviously once you get into an election, they're very tight, especially whether that's local or general. But any other time, really, you can kind of spend what you like because you're not in that section which they call purdah. So I think it's quite exciting. It'd be quite interesting to see, how that amount of money...
To take the wind out of Kemi Badenoch, your new leader's sails somewhat, wouldn't it?
Oh, yes, definitely. I personally think that Nigel Farage hit the nail on the head when he said half of the MPs in the Tory party should be part of the Lib Dems. And I think that's exactly the problem with this Conservative Party is that it's frankly just not very conservative at the moment. And that split, really, thought process is what has divided us on so many things, such as immigration and best ways to deliver economic growth. Hopefully this will be a kick in the right direction for the Conservatives, or if not, maybe potentially at least forcing us to do some sort of agreement with Reform.
OK, what do you think, Paul? I mean, has this got an air of foreign interference in British politics about it?
I think it has somewhat more than an air, Cristo. I think this is an absolute blatant attempt by a foreign actor to interfere in a democratic system that he doesn't understand or particularly support. And we would resist this if it was the Chinese government or the Russians or anybody else. And we should resist it just because it's a fabulously wealthy individual. The way we fund our politics in this country is from this country, and we don't want foreign billionaires interfering in this way. And I mean, if the laws allow this, I have to say then this Parliament needs to tighten up the law so that this can't happen, because the precedent it sets is that anyone can then just pile money in, especially if they control the social media. They are now, controlling the channels of communication as well, with X in particular being a place where politics is being skewed and people are being misinformed and, with real world consequences, by the way, like we saw from the rioting. So I think it's something that needs to be vigorously resisted across all political parties. This is not a party political point. Anyone who supports any shred of idea of democracy in this country needs to say no to this.
But then would that not have meant that the Labour activists that went across to America to campaign for Kamala Harris, they should be equally as condemned?
Well, they didn't go over there with £100 million in their pocket.
No, but they still were interfering
Well, they were campaigning. I mean, political geeks, go to each other's countries all the time and help out in elections, and they're all going as volunteers, and they have done for years. I mean, this has been going on for 50 years. It's not like a new thing. And then, obviously, Republicans come to this country and campaign for the Conservatives, and, there's a sort of free trade in political geekery where people like to go and help out.
So it's different. Would you say it's different? Would you say it's different to that?
No, of course it's not different. In fact, I think it's much more personal, the fact that someone's going out to go and knock doors. I think at the very least he's going, here's the money, but this party can do what they want with it. It's interesting, though, in the sense that Elon Musk a few years ago was a bit of a darling to the left-wing lot, because he was the kind of the green eco man creating all these electric cars. And since he's kind of voiced his opinions and allowed free speech to spout up on Twitter, all of a sudden he is being condemned by this government and snubbed, quite frankly, of his investment, which was another stupid move by this government. So I think just because he doesn't speak the narrative that people want, he's being smacked down for it. I think it's great news, and I think, look, people should be encouraged. If they've got an interest in this country and they want this country to succeed, we should welcome their money. And if he thinks,
but come on though, Harrison. Would you be saying that if a massive, to Paul's point, if this was Mr. Musk from China, you wouldn't probably be saying that. You wouldn't be saying it if it was Mr. Musk from Russia, would you?
I mean, it probably happens, doesn't it? I mean, there probably are foreign donations that are happening already. I mean, sure. I mean, the reason why we hear about Elon Musk is because he's such a public figure and he's very outspoken. And he owns the social media.
There hasn't been a foreign donation to the point of $100 million or anywhere near to it from somewhere from a country that we don't consider to be an ally. And if it were the case, and if Keir Starmer was about to accept that, with respect, Harrison, you would be absolutely apoplectic about that.
Sure. I mean, sure. I mean, I'll take your point, but in that case, then people don't have to vote for it on that basis. Then people don't have to vote for Nigel Farage and his Reform Party. If they're very, very unhappy with the way he's funded, then sure, let that be a consequence of how he's voted. But if people vote him in, then I don't see a problem with it. If that's he's not breaking the law, that's just how it is, and people don't seem to mind, and people also vote for him. I don't really see what the problem is here.
Okay, what do you think then, Paul? What do you want to say to all of that?
Well, I genuinely think that the barbarians at the gate, this is our democracy under threat. I think we have to be absolutely clear that we don't take these sort of enormous amounts of money from foreign actors who want to skew our system. And the source of it actually is not the issue, because, like you say, it could have come from a Chinese billionaire or somebody from one of the Gulf states wanting to interfere in our democracy or whatever it is. It's the principle that you can't have people coming with huge amounts of money trying to influence the way people vote in an election in the UK. There's got to be some sacrosanct principle here, which is that if we're going to fund our politics, we do it in homegrown ways.
Just one point on that, though, because Elon Musk, in fairness to him, does have a branch of X, as it was Twitter, here in the United Kingdom. He does employ people here in the United Kingdom. So to what extent does that mean he actually does have the right to... obviously he sells Teslas here. He sells products here. There are many users of X in the UK. So to what extent does that... To what extent does that mean he does have a right actually to then donate to a political party?
Well, he has the right. He has the right to have his view, and he's allowed to say what he thinks about politics. And every time he does it, it shows that he doesn't really understand our politics. But he hasn't got the right to try and buy votes, and that's the accusation and the danger. I mean, my understanding is he was somebody who grew up in apartheid South Africa, and now he's an American citizen. But he's not a British citizen, is he? Regardless of his business interests. So I don't think he should be buying the votes of Brits.
All right, listen, good to talk to you both. Really interesting views from both of you. Paul Richards, former Labour Special Advisor, Harrison Allman-Varty, Conservative Borough Councillor, with our head-to-head.
Head-to-head.